Welcome to the 8th presentation in the series where we're looking at the book of Deuteronomy. As usual, let's just reflect back on the previous presentation. We recognized there that there was a danger of confusion surrounding this word worship. As soon as you mention that word, it creates all kinds of mental pictures. You'll recognize some of these. Maybe they're the pictures that you have in your mind. This is the danger. We end up describing worship by what we are doing in our particular group. And then there's our real danger. We can end up worshipping what we do. Worship is something very, very different. It's our response. All the things that God has done for us. All that God is. It's our response to Him. It's an expression of gratitude, celebration, commitment. When we put God at the center of the frame like that, it changes our way of thinking. It also changes our lifestyle. Because worship is living, not what we do on a Sunday or whenever we hold our meetings. That's one possible way of describing it, living the Jesus way. Jesus worked tirelessly to bless others and to bring justice to those around. That's our task. That's worship. We live Jesus before the watching world. You could rephrase it that way. Worship is lifestyle. But what we worship determines our lifestyle. Put God in the center of the frame, it changes things in how we live. And what we end up doing on a Sunday is just simply a means to an end to help us to live by worship and to worship by living. In the Deuteronomy context, there was the worship that the Canaanites practiced. They were trying to please an angry deity, persuade him to bless them with good crops. So they were manipulating the deity. But there was a lot of occultic activity there at that time, and there still is today. We're trying to manipulate others or life events. We think that by all sorts of spiritual so-called activities we can improve ourselves, some sort of spiritual evolution. And we end up worshipping things, objects, events, mystical phenomena. And our logic and our reason just go out of the window. By contrast, the worship that Deuteronomy pictures is this: a willing and joyful response in gratitude for all that God had done for them, all that God has done for us. And it's based on evidence, who God is, what He's done. And Moses keeps going back in Deuteronomy to the historical events. There's the evidence God was at work. It's not blind faith. It's not just suspending your mental faculties. God does not call us to do that. It reflects the character and nature of the God who is worshipped. When we get God back at the center of the frame of our lives and live for Him, we start to live the Jesus way. And there's some of the characteristics: purity, truth, in short supply today, righteousness, quality living, and it promotes love. We care for others. There's a positive picture of worship, and what we do on a Sunday, however we do it, whatever our tradition may be, it's a means to an end. And if the end is not in mind, then it's just an empty, vacuous exercise. Now let's just move on to the next section. We're going to be looking at start at chapter 14 and move on from there. And the first verse sets the whole context for the whole section. Children of the Lord your God. Children reflect the nature of their human parents. We see it all the time. God's children, we reflect the nature of the God we serve. We reflect whatever we worship. Now we need to remember the background of this is that God chose this people group for a task. He didn't choose them because they were special, important, or any other reason. He chose them for a task. And the task was he wanted them to live for him. The sheer quality of living when we put God at the center of the frame. And that would show God to the people groups round about, to the wider world. We make God known by the way we live, when we live the Jesus way in modern language. He was going to give them a secure homeland. There's plenty of space in it for them. A base, a strategic base, the bridge between Africa, Europe and Asia. But this people group, would you have chosen them for this task? They were descendants of a rabble who'd been rescued from slavery in Egypt. And they were going to face totally unfamiliar situations in the land. The whole way the land operated, the whole agricultural setup was completely different from anything they'd seen in Egypt, and certainly anything they'd seen in their desert wanderings. And that's what Moses was doing. You're going to face a radical change. Here's God's directions for what lies ahead. Then, securing the land, they could live to reflect the nature of God before the watching world, the people groups around, and make an impact, which is what God wanted this people group to do for him. Let's put that opening verse in its wider context. You are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourself or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. A very strange start when we first read it. What on earth was Moses trying to communicate? Now, in the original, the word that's translated children is in the emphasized position of the sentence. That's the thrust, that's the key thing. You're to reflect God. You're his children. But the next sentence is, we have to recognize that this is the kind of thing that was happening in the Canaanite population. It was a kind of ritual respect for the dead, mourning rites. They worshipped the dead. Don't go that way. You're the children of God. Don't start worshipping your ancestors. You're my children. Holy to the Lord your God. That means they were set apart to reflect God's nature. And God's nature wasn't that they should mutilate themselves. They were God's creation. They were not to mutilate themselves in some kind of mourning rites, respect for their ancestors. And the word chosen is always used in the entire biblical text in the context of being chosen for a purpose or a task. Never chosen on merit, never chosen as an elite, and never chosen to get to heaven. The word is never used that way anywhere in the biblical record. It's chosen for a task, for a purpose. Now, moving into the text itself. Do not eat any detestable thing is where it starts in verse 3. And as soon as we read that, it pictures up ideas like we're coming into food laws. Categorically, that's not what Moses was about. You may have heard food laws in Deuteronomy and elsewhere in the Old Testament. It's not what it's all about. Moses is giving them principles to guide healthy living. They were going into a new kind of lifestyle, a land, unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar activities. They need to be physically fit, spiritually fit. Here's some directions. That's what this is all about. And we'll see in a moment or two reasons why Moses gave these directions. Now the word detestable there gives us the clue. It's used elsewhere in Deuteronomy, and it's used in the context of the evil practices associated with fertility worship, which is what the Canaanites were doing, which then led to temple prostitution and child sacrifice in the end of the day. So the principles there are related to not going down the way of the Canaanite religion, because that hurt and damaged people. Think of all the young people that were damaged by temple prostitution, and the infants that lost their lives as sacrifices. Don't go that way. Into the text now. Do not eat any detestable things where it started. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, the mountain sheep. Now, we're not quite sure what these animals are in every case. They were not biological experts then. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof that chews the cud. Now there's a rule of thumb, because they could see that with their eyes. However, of those that chew the cud or that have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel, the hare, or the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. That's the rule of thumb. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean, although it has a divided hoof. It does not chew the cud. You not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. Of all the creatures living in the water you may eat any that has fins and scales, but anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat. For you it is unclean. You may eat any clean bird, but these you may not eat: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, the black kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the cormorant, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. Again, not always is it clear what these birds may be. All flying insects are unclean to you. Do not eat them. But any winged creature that is clean to you, you may eat. Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it. Or you may sell it to other foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, when we read that lot, our eyeballs roll. What on earth is this all about? The strange mumbo-jumbo of so-called food laws. It's because we're thinking of it as food laws. It's not food laws. It's directions for living. Now, the reason they could give it to the foreigner was that if it was already dead, they couldn't be certain the blood had been drained away, which was important. We've seen that already. Now, we don't know why that was so important, except that they had the symbolic idea that blood was the basis of life. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that. But it wasn't a problem for foreigners, so don't stop them eating it if they want to. The last little phrase almost certainly reflects a Canaanite religious practice, which is why it's there. The food laws are there in part because of Canaanite religion. They were involved in animals in their religious practices. And there's a document that refers to this. Moving on. Summarizing it. Now you can put up lists like that. Things that are permitted, not permitted. But that's not very helpful, because we don't fully know from the documentation that's available, which is limited, exactly what was happening in the Canaanite religion in relation to animals. Nor are we 100% certain about the identification of the animals. But gives a pattern. Why the pig? Now, it's known to be associated with some religious rituals in both the Canaanite and Hittite religions. And this area had been part of the Hittite Empire at one time, and there were Hittites still living there. Don't get involved with animals that are associated with their religion. You're starting to develop a compromise and you're running risks. But there may be another reason for these food directions. Perhaps it relates to health and hygiene. Now, those who are experts in it have noted that there's some evidence of increased levels of toxicity in the forbidden animals. Remember, they had no means of storing food, no refrigeration, and the climate could be very hot. Decay would set in quickly. And so, for example, shelled fish become toxic very quickly after death. So there may be an element of that there. Here's some guidance for you so you don't end up poisoning yourselves or becoming ill. But we also know that some of the animals were associated with the worship patterns in Canaan. So these rules of thumb, this guidance, apply in that particular pair of circumstances. And when we go into the New Testament, it's made very clear that all foods are open to human beings. God made everything. Because patterns of life had changed by then. And although they didn't have refrigeration, they knew a lot more about how to use salt to preserve foods. But we've got to be cautious, not be too dogmatic. But that is why they were given this set of principles and guidelines. A kind of rule of thumb. They're going to meet new animals, new situations, new circumstances. What were they to do? Here is a kind of rule of thumb. So they could avoid hurting themselves or letting themselves become associated with the wrong religious patterns of the Canaanites related to fertility worship and then get sucked into that. But we've got to be cautious. We can't be too dogmatic about this. But what we can be certain about is the principles are important. God's people need to be fit and well to fulfill whatever tasks God has for us to do in our lives. That is what Moses is directing them towards. You're God's people. You're God's children. You're going to carry out God's task. That's what I have for you to do. To live godly lives. Quality living. I will provide for you if you just trust me for it. Go forward on that basis. But be cautious in what you do. Now, there are enormous messages for us today, particularly in the West, where there are all kinds of illnesses that are being generated by our lifestyle and by our abuse of food. Too much so-called junk food lying around, while overweight and obesity is everywhere, and it increases the chance of certain key diseases. And if we get these diseases, it's going to hinder us to fulfill whatever God has for us to do. We must be fit and well. We've got to be disciplined. There's principles there that are incredibly important for us in the 21st century. But the details applied in the days of Moses and may or may not be relevant for us today. Now, let's move on again to the next section. Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your corn. Tithe just means 1/10. New wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant and you've been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is too far away, then exchange your tithe for silver. Take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no land allotted to them or any inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites who have no land allotted them or any inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. This sets the principle of tithing. It's an expression of gratitude to God. He provides the food. But it's also a provision for others who, for various reasons, don't have their own supply of food. It still envisaged here in the text some sort of centralized tabernacle or temple. The whole group had gathered around this tabernacle, this mobile temple that they carried throughout the desert. And it was set up centrally in the land when they entered the land. And it was the focal point for their coming together as God's people. The temple wouldn't be built for a few hundred years yet. They were going to live an agricultural lifestyle, but some had no provision. Levites, that group descended from the tribe of Levi, they were to serve God in the tabernacle and in various other roles in society, and they didn't have fields of their own. There are also foreigners, people traveling through, or foreigners who lived with them. Remember, it wasn't ethnic cleansing, people were absorbed. But widows and orphans had no means of providing for their food, because it was a male-orientated society. Wider society had a duty to provide for them. And it was provided for them, and there's a kind of pattern. Incredibly important principles which still apply today. Now you can find this, the tithing idea, in 3 places. It sets the principle. A tenth devoted to the Lord, and no manipulation was to use to get it back. In Numbers, they were to use the tithe, or part of it, in this case the whole of it is pictured here, to provide for that group who didn't have agricultural land of their own. Here in Deuteronomy it extends it a bit further. It's providing for the Levites, but also those in need, and the basis for celebration as a people group. Not a negative thing. It's not a rule book mentality. It's an expression where we appreciate all that God has given to us, and we use a tenth of that, and it doesn't have to be a mathematical tenth, the principle is important, for the benefit of others, if you're like the have-nots of society. Principle of gratitude, provision for the Levitical priesthood, but they also had to tithe too, and the provision for the have-nots of society, and also a celebration as a complete society. The tithe, I can summarize it this kind of a way. It's an expression of our gratitude to God for His provision, but it provides for others in the process. It's an interesting observation that many have made over many years, that those who practice tithing, and again I stress, don't look at it mathematically, in gratitude to God, can often be more than that. Those who practice that never lack. At the same time, those who practice that help others so that they never lack. A wonderful divine principle for the benefit of humanity. Moving into chapter 15. At the end of every 7 years you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they've made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for cancelling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. However, there need be no poor people among you, for on the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you, if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I am giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, and you will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. Foreigner there, because they be travellers. They'd be gone. So if you lend someone, get it back before they move forward. That sentence is often misrepresented and taken out of its context. It's in the context they're about to enter the land. If they follow what God's directing them to do and be, commands as directions, life directions, if they did that, they would be so prosperous, they wouldn't need to borrow from other people, and they wouldn't be overrun by other people either. That's what it's saying. We have to interpret that sentence in its context and not rip it out of its context and make it mean what we want it to mean. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbour this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for cancelling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will towards the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you'll be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, even if it's just another year and you won't get it back. And do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. That's the principle that's been observed. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. That's an eye-watering principle when you think about it. Amongst the people of God, as they're entering the land, every 7 years all debts cancelled. It didn't apply to foreigners because they would tend to be passing through or trading. So it's people who are resident in the land. Now that's the reason why it was given. Getting into debt was a major problem. One poor harvest or the death or illness of the wage earner could leave a family destitute. And the only way they could survive was to sell themselves into slavery, probably closer to service, to some other family. You see that today in many parts of the world, which are dependent on agriculture. Widows and orphans have a tough time. And the principle means that you're released from such situations. But it emphasizes the way that individuals who've had hard times were to be helped and respected. We don't take advantage of them, we don't abuse them. But it also has that wonderful benefit. In every society, there's a tendency for people, and it's sometimes a bit of chance, to accumulate the wealth. And others get less and less and less. And in past decades, particularly the last 10, 15 years, in the West, there has been a growth in multi-billionaires, and they use their money to make sure that the governments of their countries don't pass any laws or leave the laws with loopholes in them, so their wealth can never be touched. And they get wealthier and wealthier. Meanwhile, there are significant majorities who are on the breadline. There's a great principle here that he's pondering through that affects practical life and political decision taking. You see, it's radical. All the people of God were to be treated equally. The needs of the poor will always be met. That's the aim. Because that reflects the nature and generosity of God. He gives to all people. He'll provide for all people. It's only our human selfish nature that perverts, undermines and destroys that. That's the reality, but that's the goal. And we human beings have got the opportunity to get nearer the goal and reverse the reality. At that time, the reality was that there was always the possibility that something would go wrong and a family would be left destitute. But the whole community could be together and share because God had given to them. So that's the principle behind the whole idea here, and a principle that we need to grasp and rethink in our communities of faith today. There's enough in the world for everyone. And if it's shared, we could all have enough. God's people need not be dependent on other people groups. And we need not be overrun by other people groups. It depends on our obedience to following God's directions, doing it God's way, and not pursuing our selfish agendas. God will provide for us if we've set our mind to fulfill His mission. The task which He's chosen us to fulfill, to make Him known to the wider world. And when we set that as our priority and goal to live for God in whatever way God has directed you, or your Christian community, God will provide everything you need. But there's a principle of sharing, protecting others. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you for 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That's why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he'll become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand, and the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. So here we see people who've, as it were, sold themselves into slavery or service because they've had hard times. Paying off the debt, that's all they could do in those days. Closer to an unpaid servant rather than the picture of a slave. But after the period of time, if they're sent away after 7 years, that they're sent away empty-handed, they can't break out of this poverty cycle. But they could choose to stay. So they had two opportunities, and it was their choice. But if they chose to leave, they had to leave with a good provision to get them started again. There's the principle, and it still rules today. We have a danger in our competitive Western societies today of those who can and those who are successful gain everything, and the rest get the scraps. That's not God's way. Set apart for the Lord your God every firstborn male of your herds and flocks. Do not put the firstborn of your oxen to work, and do not shear the firstborn of your sheep. Each year you and your family to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God, the place he will choose. If an animal has a defect, is lame or blind, or any serious flaw, you must not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. You are to eat it in your own towns. Both the ceremonially unclean and the clean may eat it, as if it were gazelle or deer. But you must not eat the blood. Pour it out on the ground like water. Celebration. Gratitude for God's provision. But that little section is a kind of transition into the next section. So let's move forward. Observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, because in the month of Aviv he brought you out of Egypt by night. Sacrifice as the Passover to the Lord your God an animal from your flock or herd at the place the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt. Let no yeast be found in your possession all of your land for 7 days. Do not let any of the meat you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain until morning. Certain amount of reflection back on their wonderful release from slavery in Egypt. You must not sacrifice the Passover in any town the Lord your God gives you, except in the place he would choose as a dwelling for his name. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening, when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Egypt. Roast it and eat it in the place the Lord your God will choose. Then in the morning return to your tents. For 6 days eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day hold an assembly to the Lord your God, and do no work. Doing it in a specific location was to prevent them doing what the Canaanites were doing, which meant setting up little worship centers all over the place. And it was a free-for-all. Count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing corn, and choose the festival of weeks to the Lord your celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God, by giving a freewill offering in proportion to the blessings the Lord your God has given you. And rejoice before the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites in your towns, and the foreigners, the fatherless and the widows living among you. Remember you were slaves in Egypt, and faith follow carefully these decrees. Celebrate the festival of tabernacles for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Be joyful at your festival, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. 3 times a year all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. Festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. Celebrations. 3 of them: Passover, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles. The Passover was at the start of the harvest, the end of the winter, so animals would just be being born. Springtime. End of the grain harvest, and then the end of the agricultural year in the autumn. Passover is what, March, April. And the month is known in different languages at that time as Aviv, Abib, or Nisan. So don't think these are contradictions, they're just different languages. Different people groups use different names. 7 weeks after the first Sabbath of the Passover. Remember, they had no calendars, no dates, no clocks. They relied on just counting and either memorizing things or notching on a piece of wood. At the end of the agricultural year, the final harvest. You find the Passover described in 3 places. Feast of Weeks is also known as the Feast of Harvest or the Feast of First Fruits. It's the grain harvest. Things would be growing over the winter, so the winter wheat would come through. Feast of Booths, Feast of Yahweh, or as the feast. Different places described with different words. The first celebrates the release from slavery in Egypt. The second is an expression of gratitude for what God has provided. And the third one, described in considerable detail elsewhere, pulling in the final harvest in the autumn. In New Testament terms, the cross and the resurrection took place at the Passover time. And the coming of the Holy Spirit took place at the time of the Feast of Weeks. Transformed into Easter and Pentecost. That's just a summary of what Deuteronomy is saying. 3 celebrations. There are times when the people came together and remembered what God had done and was doing for them. How we need to re-emphasize that. The principle there. God has done it all for us in Jesus. And He's doing it all for us today, no matter what life may be throwing at us, and it may be incredibly tough what you're going through. Get Him at the center, He'll see you through. And we have the 3 celebrations that Moses is giving to them as they entered their new agricultural life, and it was tied to the agricultural calendar. I remember their origin. God's abundant generosity after the winter months, and then the full harvest at the end of the agricultural year. Now, we're not based on agricultural lifestyle today in our industrial societies, but the principles still apply. How important. Guidance for the people as they entered into their new life in the land, bringing it together. It all goes back to their status. They are to live for God, reflecting His nature. And God's given great principles for living that apply then, but the principles are for us all. A lifestyle that reflects God's nature and points others to God, living for Him. If you're like in modern language, living the Jesus way. Watch, don't compromise. Remember that. But He'll provide only to fulfill your life task. And we need to be fit and well. We've got responsibilities in how we live, what we eat, what we do. Generosity, reflecting God's generosity to us. And we mustn't exploit others. And the great celebrations, when we bring to mind as a group all that God has done for us and is doing for us today. God's great principles for living, given by Moses to the people as they were about to enter their new phase in their living as a people group, entering the land on a new lifestyle of agriculture. Principles for living. Principles that apply today. The details don't apply. in that we're not in an agricultural lifestyle in our cultures today, particularly in the West. In the next presentation, we're going to move on to look to see the direction that God is giving about leadership, so important among God's people.